Hi, a couple of years ago I started getting into D&D. As my passion for D&D grew, so did my collection of minis, and like many others out there, I now have boxes of shame, legions of unpainted minis. Now this is my underdog story. This is me painting every single one of my miniatures. Hi guys, so today I am going to paint this big bad boy, the Dracolich from the Ravenloft D&D board game. Now, the thing with this one is you could see that there's quite large gaps sort of in between the different parts of the model. You can also see some pretty, I would say, severe mold lines and whatnot. So a first step is to clean it up, and I'm using a scalpel. If you do, please be careful. Exercise caution, and just make sure that you're smart about your choices. I clean my miniatures using just a clean toothbrush just to sort of get all of the nitty-gritty pieces out. Now, one thing I discovered also with this one was the wings. It wanted really to sort of fold them back in, which I felt like, one, it just looked wrong. I would have wanted them to be like out, looking more threatening. Usually, animals tend to try to make themselves look bigger, but these wings just wanted to go, back. So I popped on some boiled water and I bent them into shape. And the same thing with the mouth, actually. I opened the mouth a little bit. Now, for those cracks and crevices, I'm going to use Minipainting. You can, of course, use liquid green stuff or anything like that, but this is what I had at home, so, this is what I'm going to use. So, if you're using Minipainting, it's epoxy clay, so to speak, so you have to use lots of water to make it sort of not stick to your hands or whatnot. Generally, I'm not sure if this is the best way of doing it, but the way I do it is I try to sort of roll out a sausage and then lay it on top of the crack that I have, and then just use these sort of rubber tools to sort of try to push them in. And now, as usual, whenever I do Minipainting, I tend to have way too much on my hands. So I decided to do a tongue, because I saw that this Dracolich had some flesh left on its body. So I figured, why not have a tongue? And I also did some indentations on the ground. So this is the result after priming. I did a zenithal using bone white and just pure white, and you can see that the tongue and all of the ground worked out fine. So first I started out doing a thinned out base pass on using skeleton bone from Army Painter, and I pretty much covered the entire Dracolich with this, and the thing is, at one point I also switched to a larger brush just to sort of get it everywhere. Now, once I'd done that, I noticed that looking at the anatomy of this, it seemed like this used to be a blue dragon, because I think blue dragons are the ones that have that sort of characteristic horn on their head. So I used some Canter blue from Citadel to paint out the wings, which looked actually somewhat intact compared to how the rest of the body is looking, but I guess the bastard needs to fly. Now, at this point, I'm just stippling in some blue here and there. I think, honestly, I'm not entirely sure if what I'm doing is correct, but I wanted to build up sort of a base of blue, because there used to be blue, fresh, working, healthy flesh here, right? So I started out painting some blue, and I think this is where my camera actually, a big battery sort of soon will run out. I wanted to also have some red in it because it was bloody, and that was where my battery died. So I painted some red towards the fleshy parts, and I sort of tried to blend it and sort of go between blue and red. Now, of course, that meant that I had done some whoopsies, so I cleaned that up with some skeleton bone. Now, I also wanted to feather out the sort of skeleton and the fleshy parts, so I used a little bit of skeleton bone and a little bit of red I had previously to sort of just feather it out. Plus, it looks almost like rotten flesh already at this point. The next bit that I wanted to try to address was some of the highlights on the wings. So I just used whatever I had in my palette, which happened to be skeleton bone, which is a nice off-white, sort of cream white color. And I went fairly aggressively on the wings and tried to sort of dry brush in order to get some highlights. Now, the entire skeleton I pretty much covered with Citadel's Seraphim Sepia. Now you can see this, I really love this combination of skeleton bone and Seraphim Sepia. It's super good and it really makes all of the details pop. But the important thing here is try not to get as much on the flesh, just on the actual sort of bony parts, so to speak. Now, at this point, I'm fairly happy with it, but it wasn't disgusting enough. But first I needed to handle sort of the wings, so I picked up a little bit of Army Painter's blue tone in order to sort of darken them down and try to get those sort of creases out. And I pretty much just, pull it all over the actual wings. Then I started thinking, you know what? I want to sort of try to make this look a little bit more organic, so I dotted in here and there some blue wash, and this is what we have so far. And honestly, at this point I would be super happy with this, but this Dracolich, it's just a normal board game miniature, but I really got inspired, to be honest. Now, note the difference between how this looked when the paint was wet versus how it looks now when it's dry. You can see that all of the fleshy bits look very dried out. So I started out with actually making them wet again, or making sort of them red again, a little bit more vibrant. So I went over all of the fleshy parts with this Reichlen flesh shade, which sort of brings back that nice vibrance and sort of redness in the flesh. So I'm using a fairly large brush. I don't need to be super accurate at this point. It's fine if there's a little bit of drip and slope. Now here, notice this. It's nice when it's wet, and now when it's dry, it's all dulled down. We're going to address that soon, but one thing I wanted to also look at was the wings. I didn't feel like there was enough pop in terms of shadows and highlights, so I actually went with the darkest wash I have, Nuln Oil from Citadel, and just sort of tried to re-establish those edges of the wings and sort of give it a little bit more depth. And I think it turned out okay-ish, at least. At this point, I'm thinking about, the skeleton looks good, but one thing that can really sort of make it pop a little bit more is, of course, if after you've done a wash on something like skeleton, you come back with the original color and you sort of paint highlights. And you can see, like I've said before, I'm not an expert painter by far, but a trick I use is the side of my brush. I sort of place it, from a geometric point of view where I cannot possibly, let's be honest, screw this up. So I just use the side of a brush, which I find, especially with these a little bit larger miniatures, makes it a hell of a lot easier just to sort of be somewhat accurate. Even with these small dots, I'm not using the tip of my brush, I'm using the side of my brush. But I'm sort of just going through all of the bits where I think a highlight should be in, and let's not forget the pedicure, the nails. They need to have a nice little highlight on them as well. So this is what we have so far, and I'm kind of liking the so-called pop between the shadows and the highlights. And one thing with the base, like I said, I got inspired, so I figured I would, take out my Vallejo thick mud that I've used for some tiles and whatnot, and I'm just using sort of a Citadel plastic brush or whatever you call it, almost a small shovel or whatnot. Just, worked that in there everywhere, and then just made sure that the edge was sort of clean and nice. You can see it's actually quite nice, this Vallejo acrylic mud. I really do enjoy using the Vallejo products that they make. They're super good, to be honest. So once this had dried, I figured I would, or actually even before it was dried, I figured I would go a little bit maverick here and just, you know what, I need to just paint that frame, paint that black frame to sort of make everything look a little bit more elegant. So that's what we have. Now, once this was dry, I noticed that there was some shrinkage, but also one sort of setback with this is that the Vallejo mud is that it's quite monotone. So I used some Agrex Earthshade just to sort of bring out at least the shadows, because I thought that everything looked a little bit too bright. So just slobbed it on here and there, and this is what it looks like wet, and boom, let's see here. I think it's supposed to be dry in 1, 2, 3, and then bazinga. There we go. And it looks kind of nice, I have to say. I'm really liking this Vallejo mud. Now, again, looking at the sort of parts of Dracolich, you can see that the fleshy parts, they're not wet. So I went over them again, this time with some Reichland wash again, but the glossy kind. And I think I actually in between this also varnished the entire thing using just a spray varnish, a matte varnish. So everything here before I covered the last set of wash is covered with matte and then Reichland gloss shade. And you know what? I have to say, I think this is among the better minis I've done. It's actually dry at this point. You can see that the fleshy parts are nice and glossy and wet and sort of disgusting. And really the tongue also, I felt like made it look a little bit more evil. Honestly, super happy with this result. The only thing would be the wings. But enough of that, let's stay positive and let's look at some glamour shots, shall we? Alright, guys and gals out there, are you in the same situation I am with a box of shame? Comment, please, like, share, you know what, subscribe, and I hope you have an amazing day, night, evening, morning, or whenever you watch this. Until next time, toodaloo.